Hello, I'm Dan Sullivan. I'm a programmer at Film at Lincoln Center. Uh, I'm joined today by Film at Lincoln Center Director of Programming, Dennis Lim, as well as programmer at large, Rachel Rakes, and Art of the Real program advisor, Almudena Escobar Lopez. And we're going to be talking about the 2022 edition of Art of the Real, which is beginning on March 31st, running through April 7th. This is the 9th edition of Art of the Real, which is our survey of sort of innovative envelope pushing, boundary pushing, experimental, and sometimes non-experimental nonfiction cinema. So I was hoping to begin by just talking to you three a bit about sort of the context for this year's edition. But before we do, I should note that this year's Art of the Real will include premieres for 14 feature films, as well as a handful of shorts that are paired with some of the features, as you'll see in the program notes. But this year's festival will also include a retrospective sidebar dedicated to the French filmmaker Alice Diop, who will be joining us to talk about a few of her films to date. We can get a bit more into that later, I suppose, but maybe for now it'll suffice to say that Alice is one of a few filmmakers in this year's Art of the Real who are returning filmmakers whose work we've featured either in previous editions of Art of the Real or in some of our other festivals. In the case of Alice Diop, New Directors, New Films, where her previous film, her New, premiered a couple of years ago. But putting that aside for now, maybe we can get into sort of how this year's festival sort of came about, and maybe some reflections on kind of what everyone was thinking in putting together this year's lineup. Obviously, this is like a very interesting moment to be putting together or trying to put together like a documentary or nonfiction festival. We could begin by asking Dennis a bit about how this year's lineup kind of came together, and maybe how the process sort of differed from previous editions of Art of the Real, or just kind of what ambient factors in all of our lives now maybe kind of informed the way you all went about selecting the lineup. So yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. Well, I guess it's different in that this is our first full in theater edition in a few years. We did have, a 2020 lineup that we had to present online, and then in 2021 we did a retrospective only Art of the Real at a different time of the year in the fall. So yeah, this is, I think, the first time since the spring of 2019 that we've had a full week plus in cinemas with new films and older titles, which has always been the model for Art of the Real since Rachel and I started it in 2014. In terms of the process of selection, I don't know that it was really any different. I mean, it's just a matter of keeping tabs and watching films through the year, as do both Rachel and Almudena. I'm not sure we really, speaking personally at least, I don't really think so much about thematic connections or through lines to the program, until I should say the final stages, but because looking at the lineup as we were finalizing it a few weeks ago, it does seem like a really diverse but also like coherent group of films to me. I'm pretty happy with how these films play alongside one another, how they fit together and how they might speak to one another. But in terms of the process, we're just excited to be back in cinemas, as you know, and to have also, I should say, many filmmakers in attendance. People seem really eager to be presenting their films, watching films with an audience, actually having like real life interactions, as we found with our programs that have returned to cinemas. But yeah, I'll let Rachel and Almu jump in if they have thoughts on overall context before we start talking about the lineup.
We were able to put together a tight selection out of kind of the last almost 2 years. We had time to really kind of reflect and process on what we felt like were important and representative films to put together, given that we didn't have this edition last year. And not necessarily theme, but I guess in terms of form, something that struck me as I was reflecting, and yeah, again, like Dennis said, it's kind of after the fact more than in the process of selecting films, is a focus on the idea of staging. I was going back to, we'll talk a bit about the films individually in a moment, but I was going back to Anocha's work, Come Here, and this is where staging has this big sort of presence narratively. It sort of makes the sort of film function. And I was thinking how that also comes around in a film like Camouflage or in Afterwater, where the elements of hybridity, or the elements where they sort of merge away from just being a documentary, happen in the act of staging. So I thought of that as kind of maybe an interesting thing to sort of keep in mind going through many of the films.
To me, I was thinking there is a lot of films also after the fact, because the process was the same for the three of us. I think there is a lot of films that are operating in a multiplicity of time and connecting different spaces. So they are very heterotopic in the way they are built. And then there's this connection between multiplicity and individual stories, which it seems to be a trend. But I think this year more than ever, also the way we are acting between being together and being apart, I think it is even more present in the entire program.
Just jumping off of what Amandina was saying, I can kind of just transition from that into the opening night film. As if we're talking about multiplicity, then Mistos Voces is kind of a nice way to begin. So our opening night film is Lina Rodriguez's Mistos Voces, My Two Voices, which is a film shot on 16 millimeter. That is a portrait of migration, of 3 women in migration from Mexico and Colombia to Canada. And what immediately struck me about that work is the visual sense of this sort of what would be maybe called abstraction, but in the framing of like these intense sort of close-ups and gestures that very much reminded me of some more kind of avant-garde work from the 70s, especially say Chick Strand, but done with such an updated sense of an ethic and empathy, a kind of a sense of how to approach a subject and the kind of nuances of the people that Lina's working with, and even her own voice as well. So just to begin with that.
I'll just jump in and say, Dan, you mentioned returning filmmakers, and we've shown Lina's fiction films at Lincoln Center this time tomorrow, and Señoritas, and I think this is the first time we're showing a documentary of hers. And I think that the effect of that film, just what the film achieves through what the formal strategies that Rachel described is, I think it's a really interesting like rethinking of a type of documentary that we might, it's like a sort of a testimonial documentary, but I think done in a way that reinvents it. I think in a way that I find really moving. It's also one of several films shot on 16 millimeter, I should say, that in the lineup. So I think medium specificity seems important to the filmmakers in this year's lineup. And I should also add one of 3 films from Canada, I think, by 3 young women filmmakers from Canada, Miriam Charles and Jacqueline Mills, who are showing their work, I think, for the first time as well. And they also both worked on 16 millimeter, now that I'm thinking about it. Miriam Charles with This House and Jacqueline Mills with Geographies of Solitude.
why don't we move on to the longest film in this year's lineup, The Plains, David E. Steele's feature debut. I think there's a fair amount of anticipation from the art of the real, the hardcore art of the real audience to see this one. This is right in their wheelhouse. So yeah, Dennis and Rachel, could you tell us a bit about The Plains and I guess what people can expect when they come to see it at the Art of the Real premiere?
People can expect a lot of driving. I don't know. Rachel, you want to go? I should say this. I'm very excited. This is probably the first film we invited, even though it just premiered in Rotterdam. We saw it like last year, and we're very excited about it and invited it immediately. The film, it's kind of hard to. I think it's kind of hard to explain why it works so well. It's a series of drives, a series of commutes. It unfolds almost entirely inside a car, fixed camera, sometimes a solitary driver, sometimes with a companion. There are phone calls. And, to come back to what Rachel was saying earlier about staging, I think this is a film that is also very interesting to think about in those terms. I don't really want to give too much away. I mean, David E. Steele, the filmmaker, is coming, and I think we'll get an opportunity to talk to him and hear from him about how this film came about and how he made it. But the effect of the film, I mean, it's just a series of, I think, 11 or 12 shots in the car over 3 hours. It's riveting and really moving, and somehow becomes this incredible film about time and mortality and many other things. It's I think a radically simple film. I think it's also a film that does really interesting things with form and with structure. And yeah, it's kind of a perfect film for Art of the Real. It's a film that thinks about, we've been careful not to call this a documentary or nonfiction festival from the start. I think what we are interested in is how cinema, all kinds of cinema, engage with the real, and I think this film does that in really rich, surprising, and profound ways.
Yeah, I think it's rare to find a film like this that's so structured, that has this extent, that is kind of more or less within nonfiction, but is also fun, and chatty and just curious and sort of, just takes you along with it. I made the joke, which I think Dennis probably hates, which is that it's the nonfiction. I think it's nonfiction's Drive My Car.
I think that's great. I think we need to use that. Yeah.
That's my tagline for it, and I think that works well, even as well as the length and the kind of the intimacy, and then made at the same time. So that's what I'm going with.
We'll have to tease out that connection more when David is in town. But I was hoping we could now turn to film by one of the returning filmmakers, Jonathan Perel, Camouflage. Maybe we can start with Almudena. Would you like to tell us a bit about Camouflage, and maybe sort of how it resonated with you? What made you enthusiastic about this one?
Well, I think first of all, we showed the film Corporate Accountability 2 years ago from Jonathan, and this is different, but also very, very, very much connected, because he's still working with questions of memory, collective memory, and how to deal with the dictatorship in Argentina that happened between 76 and 83. But in this case, instead of using the voice off over this corporations that had this direct connection with the dictatorship, he is using a personal and direct account, but also fictional account. So he worked with Felix Bruzzone, which is a writer that wrote this very important book about the Campo de Mayo area, the Campito area, which was this massive complex secret prison complex where people were taken and disappeared during the dictatorship. And he's using him as a conduct to kind of like walk through the space. And I think it is, again, there's a mix between things that happened to him. His mom, Felix's mom, disappeared and during the dictatorship, but also different accounts of different people that lives in this area of San Miguel in Buenos Aires, where the Campo de Mayo was. And I think what is interesting about the film is not only using this conduct of this only character that it moves us through, but the moving through. And kind of walking through the spaces and kind of seeing how people reflect on the geography of the place. There's this run that they do through every year, and there's people taking selfies, you know, it's such a theatric place, and kind of thinking about how it reflects back and kind of posing it more as a question that kind of having any conclusion or any presentation and on how this memory operates, but just kind of let it play, which I think it is really, really unique and interesting.
Oh, yeah, I'll just add that I think movement is so important in this film, and also so surprising coming from, you know, Johnny Perel. I mean, if you know his other films, like he makes these, as Alma was saying, like, you know, this film's about just the legacy of the military dictatorship, but he's generally made these very like formal structural films, sort of, you know, in the vein of James Benning or Heinz Emmett-Holz, these like very, very composed, structured pieces. He actually, when he sent the film to us, he said, this is a very different film. There are people and there's movement, you know, so like just to have human subjects and to have this incredible sense of movement that is so much a part of the film's meaning. I think it's a really interesting continuation of his project, but also a really, really interesting and fun departure. We actually have fun films this year, I think, you know, in terms of like very, very cinematic experiences. Yeah, we're excited. We're excited that he's coming. Actually going to be able to be with us, because when we showed Corporate Accountability, that was the year we moved the festival online. So he'll be in person to present in New York.
Maybe on the subject of movement, we should turn to a film by another returning filmmaker, someone whose work we've shown in a few different contexts over the years. The new film by Nocha Sawicz-Kornpong, Come Here. Rachel, do you want to tell us a little bit about Come Here and maybe about its the short film that we're screening with it, Peter, the new film by Peter Sherkowski, Train Again.
I initially, in this conversation, kind of was comparing Come Here to the film we just discussed, Camouflage, in that there's something happening where it's like it's taking place in this moment of intense fraught history. In this case, the infamous Death Railway built in World War II by prisoners of war in Thailand. But what in this case, what happens, sort of what takes place within this, you know, like within and around this context, is all of these other things, like a series of kind of actions and rehearsals, a bit of romance. There's like this element of this sort of mystery throughout. And so like I've come to loathe a bit the term hybrid film because it's sort of maybe been overused or lost its meaning, but this kind of truly is in that it really does infuse. There is found or pre-existing footage alongside this sense of kind of just this curious coming together of friends. There's like these moments of intentional kind of acting or screen tests. It's quite a curious work that deals with its history in this oblique way, which I think helps to make it a little bit more kind of clear or seeable. And I think that's quite also similar to a film like Camouflage, where it's like we're starting to realize how much not taking things so head on in sort of documentary nonfiction film is actually a more interesting or maybe more kind of sensible way to reach people with these ideas and things.
I do think it's a great pairing, and I will give Rachel full credit for the Train Again, Come Here. I love when very different types of films play together, but that makes sense together. And I think that's the case with these two films. And it's nice to be able to be showing a Peter Czerkawski film on 35 millimeter.
And another pairing of a short and a feature in this year's lineup, it's particularly inspired, is the pairing of Charlene Bamboat's "If From Every Tongue It Drips" and Beatrice Santiago Munoz's "The Crow, the Trench, and the Mare." Almu, could you tell us a little bit about this pairing, and maybe like elucidate a little bit what's like exciting about this juxtaposition of films?
Yeah, I think, again, as I was saying at the beginning, this is one of the examples of this heterotopic spaces that are mixing and combining different voices. In the case of Beatriz Santiago Muñoz, El Cuervo, la Yegua y la Fosa, as the title in Spanish, it is combining and looking at the connection between all these Caribbean spaces and thinking about placemaking in that way. So it's connecting Tahiti with Puerto Rico and New Orleans, and using this Sanskrit method of poetry, where you can tell two stories at the same time, in the same space, and in the same story. And then if you look at Charlene's, it's also connecting three different spaces: this Batikaloa in Sri Lanka, and then Montreal in Canada, and the Sky Island in Scotland, and talking about questions of colonialism and queerness that way, right? But through the sound, in this case, in Charlene's film, and also using poetry, in this case, Rakti poetry and music, to kind of reflect on all these things, and also using language in both cases, and how language is not a unidirectional way of translation, but how can you translate things that are present through matter or through feelings? So it's also in that way, I think both films are very experiential, just kind of how they move through these spaces, and also how they use different tools. How do you think about smell mixing with sound in the case of Beatriz, or how do you think about the sound that is coming from this Sky Island and is reflecting in Sri Lanka, and how can you be in all these places at the same time, which seems pretty obvious when you think about colonialism, right? But I think Charlene does a really good job putting that together through the sound and the image. So I'm very, very excited about this pairing. I think it's something that both Rachel and I specifically, Dennis, I hope you're also excited, but I think we were particularly really, really looking forward to it. And I think it's a great pair.
And maybe just to conclude our conversation about the whole slate of premieres at this year's Art of the Real, we could we can go around the horn, and if there's any if there are any films we haven't discussed yet that you'd like to call out briefly, to whet people's appetites or what have you. Maybe we could start with Rachel. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, as we were talking about the planes, and I was saying that, it's somehow it's structural but not boring. It reminds me of Jerónimo Rodriguez's The Veteran, which Jerónimo was with us in 2016, Art of the Real, with his The Monument Hunter. And this work, in some ways, it feels like another kind of chapter in how he visually makes these films. It's through these still images of landscapes with this voiceover that always mixes kind of like testimony with histories, with bits of fiction. And the whole thing for me paces and sort of runs through like you're experiencing a novel. I find it extremely sort of stimulating, entertaining, and also like just really curious to find what he minds in all of these spaces and the way that he puts them together. In this case, between primarily Chile and New York, which was also quite similar to the way that he structured the previous. So it almost feels like he's conducting these sort of chapters in this sort of longer body of work that I find really fascinating.
What about you, Dennis? Anything we haven't talked about yet that you want to flag for everyone's attention?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is a really good lineup. I think we have a really exciting group of films. I would just encourage people to come to as much as they can, not least because we have a very good deal all access pass, especially if you're a student. But just the, what's even occurring to me as we're talking about these connections among the films that I think are really exciting to think about. Alma was talking about language, and I think we haven't talked about Lina Rodriguez's film in terms of language too, and I think that's really, that's really something that she's working with in terms of how the voices are assembled in Mistos Voces, and also thinking that, Miriam Charles's film This House, which is a sort of this ghost story, a film about grief and mourning, is also a film about migration, and I think really pairs really nicely with Lina Rodriguez's film in that regard. I guess one other, theme that it's so broad as to I don't know if you want to even call it that. It's like, is just this presence of nature in the films, this question of bodies and nature. I think Geographies of Solitude is a really interesting sort of rethinking of a portrait film and a landscape film at the same time. And as we were, slotting the films and scheduling them, it occurred to me that two films by returning filmmakers, Donna Comian, who we've shown in the New York Film Festival, and George Jacome, who we've shown in the New York Film Festival and in New Directors. Their new films, After Water and Supernatural, are these really, I think, great pairings, a pair of films about bodies and nature, and that also are very sort of these immersive, dreamy sort of viewing experiences. Donna's film After Water is a film about limnology, the study of lakes, and George Jacome's film Supernatural is this very strange, trippy, glitchy, like meditation on the idea of the natural. It's kind of an essay film, you could say. And yeah, I think we have them scheduled on back-to-back nights. So yeah, I'd urge people to just explore the connections among the films here. They're not even, we're not even necessarily very apparent to us until now we're looking at the lineup, and we're finding it that these films that are interesting to think about together. I feel like I should at least just quickly mention a couple of other films that we haven't. Beatrix's Austrian film, which is I think a very original take on a portrait film, you could say. Also, this Zheng Fan Yang's Footnote is we definitely saw too many pandemic films in the programming process. I think anybody who's looking at new films tends to encounter a large number of films that were shot during lockdown, about lockdown, but I think this one does something formally very interesting. Another returning filmmaker, Eric Baudelaire, his new film When There Is No More Music to Write, reminiscent, I think, in some ways to me of his collaborations with. Collaboration is such a big part of Eric's project. Like as with his Masao Adachi films, I think here he's working with the composer and sound artist Alvin Curran, and again looking back at a period of radical politics and how that intersects with artistic practice in a way that I find really, really interesting. So yeah, I don't know if I've covered everything, but I'm trying to just suggest the breadth of the lineup that we have here, and encourage people to come to us as much as we can. Again, many filmmakers will be here with their films.
I can add on the note of sort of the way of traversal, the way that Eric's film is traversing, kind of connecting these. He's always connecting, a struggle in one place and a struggle in another, right? In this case, sort of Italy and the US. And so I wanted to highlight one other feature, which is a Marble Travelogue, which deals more with the element of Greek marble and kind of follows its path. But in this, it's sort of there are many sort of films about consumer objects and and how they come about and all of the elements. But in this case, the way that it goes sort of back and forth, in this case from Greece to where it's manufactured in China, back to Greece to be sold again to tourists who perhaps are from China to bring back to China again as souvenirs from Greece. And he talks about this entire sort of political economy of this. And I think that's very, these senses of there's a lot of films in this series that are very much in one place. And then there are these senses of these films that are kind of everywhere at once. And I think that's a fun juxtaposition.
I just wanted to add, because Dennis mentioned both Beatrix, and also we mentioned Eric Baudelaire's film Abril, Monte, which is one of the shorts that is paired with Eric's film. It kind of does both. It is a portrait film, but it's also a portrait of a place and a geography. It is a film set in Colombia, in Santa Teresa, in this area, in Tolima, where it's really taking this question of a collective memory of this 1929 revolution that just lasted one day. But she's using this fictional character, this woman Aura, to kind of walk through the entire thing. And also that nature itself is reflecting on the stories that haven't been told. It kind of works almost as a fictional real space, both things together, to kind of construct these stories that have been silenced. So it's using, again, a portrait and portrait and geography and multiplicity to kind of tell the story of a place. So I think it ties together all these things that we're talking about.
Maybe just to conclude, I want to talk a bit about the retrospective sidebar at this year's Art of the Real, which is dedicated to the French filmmaker Alice Diop. For the past, I guess, decade and a half, Alice Diop has very consistently been making documentaries about the Parisian banlieue, or the suburbs, and her work, we've shown it before. We premiered her most recent feature, New Directors, New Films, a couple of years ago, and that film is going to be released in the United States soon, but she's going to be joining us during Art of the Real to talk about that film, as well as two of her previous features, The Death of Danton and On Call, or La Permanence, as well as a mid-length film called Towards Tenderness. And I think for people who aren't familiar with Alice's work, I think you'll find that there's quite a bit there to think about, and it's really no surprise that I think her background is or she has a degree in visual sociology, and I think you feel that quite strongly in the work, just with the level of precision that she applies to sort of portraying like the people who live in the Paris suburbs. She films them compassionately. She takes in sort of the entirety of their sort of social circumstances and all the factors that are kind of conspired against them. And it's also a bit of her project sort of hinges on, I think, trying to make visible within the cinema people who otherwise there doesn't seem to be, or there hasn't been room for to date, and to sort of deal with them in a like a profoundly sort of humanist, dimensional, rich way. And so yeah, I hope you'll come and see some of her work. Again, she'll be on hand to talk about On Call, which is a sort of portrait of a health clinic for refugees, and it's both sort of like an ode to the sort of nobility of like the mission of such a thing, but also about the inadequacy of it in the face of like the sort of real needs of migrants. And yeah, so she'll be discussing that film as well as We, which I must say I prefer the French title, New. It always sounds funny saying We, but that's neither here nor there. So yeah, I mean, Dennis, was there anything you wanted to add about Alice Diop?
No, I think you put that very nicely. But yeah, we've not had retrospectives every year for Art of the Real, but I think we've always given it quite a bit of thought as to what to showcase within a relatively small program. I mean, in Alice's case, she didn't attend the audition of new directors where we showed, New, which I think was sort of her breakthrough film in the sense that it won the prize at the Berlinale. And we thought it would be nice to showcase a young filmmaker with a small but very strong body of work. We've done different types of retros that are the real. I mean, we've done, I think our first retro was devoted to Agnes Varda in 2015, and in that case we wanted to showcase an important, a really important subset of her body of work that wasn't always talked about. And we've done spotlights on Toshio Matsumoto and Bruce Bailey to highlight the connection between nonfiction and experimental cinema. And then we've had thematic programs like Counter Encounters and a focus on reenactment one year. And yeah, Alice seemed like like somebody we wanted to call attention to. I think these are really impressive films. And yeah, I think you're right, Dan, that her background, as a researcher really comes across in these films. And I'm really excited that she can finally attend a screening of a film, since we've been presenting them in her absence. So she'll be with us over that first weekend to show both her features.
All right, so we're going to leave it there for now. Again, the dates for this year's edition of Art of the Real are March 31st to April 7th. We'll all be there. We hope to see you there. Consider buying the all access pass. It's great value, and you can find out more about that as well as see all the film descriptions, the schedule, and so on filmlink.org. That's filmlinc.org. And yeah, so we'll see you there. Thanks.